Welcome to the Three Buddy Problem Podcast. I am not Ryan Naraine. I'm Dennis Fisher, guest host for the week with my buddies Juan and Costin. It's so good to see you guys. I haven't seen you guys in so long. This is great.
Yeah,
Likewise,
good
man.
to see you. Good to see you, man.
Yeah,
Thanks for taking this on short notice.
I'm happy. When Ryan texted me and asked me, I was psyched because I've been on the bench for a little bit, haven't done a podcast in 3 or 4 months, so I'm excited to talk to you guys and dig into some security news. It was a pretty busy week. I mean, I watch the podcast every week with you guys and there's always a lot going on, but this week was kind of, a lot of stuff going on here in the US politically. So there's that stuff going on, and some of that is related to security stuff that we'll talk about. But there was just like a ton of security news this week. So I think we're going to have plenty to get into.
It was the same thing last week, to be honest. Like I'm barely catching up with all of the reading. Like this is my homework list, right? You kind of sit down and go, okay, like here's and I used to be able to prep for this podcast like about an hour and a half before. I'd be like, all right, cool. Like I kind of got it under my belt. Kostin's going to do all the hard work. And then I'll just like come in with the hot takes. But dude, it's been the past 2 weeks have just been like, I need like 2.5 hours just to sit here and like catch up with everything that's getting done.
Yeah, now you see what it was like for us journalists, like actually trying to do this every day, like, pick the things to write about or talk about or do videos about. It used to be slow, but then not these days.
How much of that is political reality at this point? How much of it is just dumping stuff? And then how much of it is the industry actually outputting this much more? Like, I'm happy if it's the last scenario, right? Like everyone's just got so much cool shit that this is going to be the new throughput. Like everyone just dumps research at this scale. But if it's all politics, then it's just kind of a bummer.
Yeah, well, it's probably some of both. I mean, this week specifically, the last 2 weeks, I think some of it is the politics thing. But there also seem to be just like a whole bunch of research reports and interesting bugs that came out in the last 3 or 4 days. You guys have both been on CTI teams for a long time and know how that stuff works. So there does seem to be like a rhythm to it where you're like, oh, Sentinel-1 put out this report, and then the next day, like, oh, Mandiant put out a sort of overlapping report, and then somebody else put out an overlapping report, and then somebody else did a different thing. You're like, oh my God, can you guys like spread this out so that we don't get destroyed every week?
I would love it if we could all like. I think there was much more coordination back in the day, where it wasn't pure coincidence that you might get like Symantec and Kaspersky and ESET sort of publishing around the same time on the same topic. And I thought it was actually cool, right? Like you would get complementary views from different folks. You would get a certain amount of like double checking. Now it's not really that coordinated as much as I kind of get the sense you've got the folks who are trapped by their paywalls. Like they sell private reporting services, so they've had intel on something, but it's something that they're kind of required to provide to paying customers first, and then somebody else will drop a blog around the same topic and they're like, oh shit, right, and they like clean it up and sort of like drop their version of it. But it kind of makes everything seem like just uncoordinated in a way that it's not as enjoyable for those of us doing the follow-up on the outside, right?
By the way, another thing which may be stopping people from synchronizing releases as much as we used to is that at least I remember cases when we really got burnt by the other party. So we agreed, for instance, in one case, we are all going to publish on Monday, like everything was prepared, like, journalists were pre-briefed. And then I think it was on Sunday, like somebody else who agreed to publish on Monday drops their research. And we were like, what's going on? Like we agreed that everyone's publishing on Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And they were like, yeah, but our PR people. And like, man, when PR people dictate when you release your research, then something is wrong. Yeah,
But that's some convenient excusing. There were cases, and I know exactly the one you're referring to, where someone just wanted to get a little more famous and try to own something, and fuck them, right? But there's some pettiness there.
There's a lot of that. Yeah, I do remember some of those days too, in the like early SaaS days when you guys would have like the research that you were, the first full day drop a big, thing, like whether it was equation group or something like that. And, in the hours leading up to that, everybody is just nervous, like, is somebody going to screw this?
Mm.
And sometimes somebody did, sometimes they didn't. But yeah, that kind of anxiety leading up to that is never fun.
It's made it honestly, it feels really hard. Like I remember back in the SaaS days, we would all like there was some serious competition, right? Like Great
Yeah.
was like 40 some people. You the conference at its height, I think maybe grew to 300 attendees. So it was you knew that not everybody in the team was going to get to go, and there was a lot of competition even internally to have like something big enough and cool enough, and you wanted to surprise each other. You were working on it for months. And to be fair, like now with what I consider sort of our iteration with LabsCon, it is so hard to have a project that will withstand the test of time. It's not going to get scooped. It's not going to get sort of fragmented and partly released by someone else in a matter of like between the time you do the CFP and the time you actually do the publication, like the pace of research publications now is so high. And I'm not going to say the standard is lower, but the the form factor is not as long form. So it's
Yeah.
just so hard to not to like have a topic that you could really devote 6 7 months to write like a full paper, really go to town on it, and not have like some you know great researcher at ESET or at Mandiant or whomever just start to sprinkle out like portions of what you were going to publish. You go, fuck, like I don't even know if this is a story worth publishing anymore. Like and it happened back in those days. Like I remember, speaking of embargo breaking folk, I remember having a SaaS talk that had already been accepted. It was a group we called the Puppeteer Group, and we had like really interesting research on that. And I want to say like 2 months before that, um, the Citizen Lab drops Pack Rat, and it was 60% or 70% of the story. It lacked the context, it lacked the attribution, like the what I thought was the really interesting shit, but it took the wind out of our sails to the point where we had to pivot and just come up with something else. Like you're just like 2 months before, we're like, okay, fuck it, we're scrapping the whole talk. I think it's funny because to this day, none of the info that we had talked about had like made it out to sea. So you go,
Oh, really?
this kind of yeah.
Hmm.
I actually not to get too in the weeds of this, but I gave an Echo Party talk, not this year but the year before, where I dropped that as like a bit of an Easter egg because I was trying to motivate people in Latin America, saying, truth is, none of these big companies really prioritize. I think I use the term "give a shit" about like Africa and Latin America. So the chances that you're going to get proper CTI devoted to that region is almost non-existent. So I went to Echo Party Argentina to like in Spanish basically say, "Hey guys, like here's some leads. You have to start doing this research work for yourself. No one's going to do it for you."
Yeah.
And in the very end, I dropped like what is actually full a trib on that now because there's like a couple of interesting like court cases and some things that have come since then. And even then, like you just don't see like that hasn't made it out to any kind of publication. So it's just like some things just kind of die on the vine or left in the cutting room floor, and they just never make it out to the public record. It's a little sad.
Yeah. Well, how much of that competition that you talking about, Juan, is kind of a function of this? There just being more CTI teams that are doing this kind of stuff than there were, say, 12, 15 years ago.
I think that is a function of it, but I think things have changed, and I wouldn't just put it as like expansion. There's
Mm.
different motivations now. You have other countries that are starting to play more of a role in dropping things, right? Like we get more stuff out of like companies in France. You get things now out of the
Yeah.
Chinese from time to time, like other players in Russia that weren't that outspoken suddenly publishing stuff. So you have more people uh, doing this, more players, but also like I mentioned, sort of the form factor has changed. You're no longer talking about um, that first mover situation in CTI where you go, hey, no one's ever seen this before. Let me give you a 60-page paper on the first sighting of this threat actor and like the 8 years of operations that nobody had seen.
Yeah.
Now it kind of, I'm not saying that everything is updates, but there's not as much like groundbreaking. We need to explain the concepts. We need to substantiate and prove that what we're claiming is even something that APTs do. A lot of that foundational work was laid out in that sort of first generation of CTI and in sort of the public view. And now what you get is not little updates. I don't want to belittle people's research, but rather like you don't have to do as much of that uplift. Like you can come in and just be like, hey, I'm talking about UEFI. Here's some bootkits. This is what this APT is doing. Look at the attribution based on like pattern or life analysis and buy. And like you don't need to spend all that time kind of being verbose about it. So I do think that there's a much more like approachable
Yeah.
scene to it.
No, you're right. Yeah, it's like you don't need the 2 intro paragraphs to tell everybody what you're about to tell them.
Right.
Like you guys did all that work 15 years ago, and so now people just sort of understand. Like this is how these teams operate. This is what APTs do. Here's some new shit.
For better and
Oh,
worse.
Yeah.
still waiting for the big thorough 60 pages report on Salt Typhoon, what it is, when they started, with the IOCs, with the other rules.
Is it
You
coming from
know.
the CSRB? Is that what you were expecting
Well,
it? Or
that's a great lead-in. Nice one, Costin. So yeah, let's dig into some of the news from this week. And as you mentioned, Costin, one of the big things that everybody in the industry has been looking at for the last few months is this Salt Typhoon intrusion, especially in the U.S. telecom networks. And one of the things that happened this week as the new administration came in is they disbanded the cybersecurity or cyber safety review board,
yeah.
which was an independent group of experts that did sort of after action reports. They did one on Log4j. They did one about the Microsoft corporate or the Outlook attacks a couple of years ago, and they were in the process of doing one on Salt Typhoon when the news came down that they were being disbanded. So I don't think we'll ever see that particular version of that report. But we all know people that were on the CSRB and
Yeah.
know what capabilities that body had and maybe didn't have, for better and worse. So maybe start with you, Jags. What was your reaction when you saw that it wasn't a surprise to me, but it was still sort
Yeah.
of like disheartening?
I mean, it wasn't a surprise, and to Ryan's credit, even though he's not with us today, he's I think he's like at the Nebula Fog hackathon, which I'm kind of jealous. I wanted to kind of join for that AI hackathon, but to Ryan's credit, he kind of predicted this, right? He was like, "Look, I doubt the CSRB is going to be here after this." Now, to be fair, it's not like this is a very pointed thing on the part of the Trump, administration. It seems to be kind of just like a general disbanding of the memberships of all these boards,
Right.
period, right? So let's not, let's not make it more pointed or dramatic than it needs to be for the time being, because you still don't know if they're going to restaff it. It's not,
Yeah.
but it's not like they just like shut the whole thing down. You just kind of kicked everyone off and start over. So there's always the possibility that Sean Planky gets on board, gets in, and goes, okay, great, let's get another cadre of people in here, and let's sort of take that back up. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I kind of, on some level, I hope that it does, but it's also an interesting moment to reevaluate what we got out of CSRB, and more importantly, like what CSRB should have been doing, could have been doing, did right, wrong. And it's brought out some interesting takes from JD Work and Errata Rob and Rob Graham and folks like that who kind of came out swinging about what was wrong with the structure of CSRB. And that's something that I would love for us to discuss and kind of like put a big kind of just just a shim in the middle of this and say, there's the people who were kind enough to put in their time for free at sort of personal expense to be a part of this experiment the first go around. And I have no criticisms. If anything, I'm only grateful that these people like Katie Masuris and Dmitry Alperovich, like, were willing to give their time to make this experiment work. And I'm nothing but respect for them. At the same time, I want to discuss the CSRB's structure and mission and what it wanted to be and what it actually turned out to be, and whether that is something that we still want around, or like if you really have a chance to hit the reset button, like what would we have expected it to be, or what should it be differently, right?
Yeah, Costin, do you have any thoughts on like the efficacy of the board and what you'd like to see if there was a new one?
On one hand, I was thinking about what the Senator Ron Wyden was saying about this. He's kind of hinting the fact that Microsoft's $1 million donation gift to the Trump inauguration might have somehow helped the demise of CSRB. I don't know if that's true. I don't like such conspiracy theories, but I mean, speaking from a practical point of view, it always felt that CSRB was in a very uncomfortable position. So, on one hand, there were like some technical people who were producing non-technical reports with some kind of a goal to influence policy making, right? But on the other hand, they had no power. There was like no real power to influence the policy anywhere. So not only that, but I think that they also, if you want, kind of step up all these investigations near the end of the Biden administration. So it was kind of, let's say, dead end. Like there was maybe no hope or no opportunity and no roadmap to implement more of those things. So I would say that it was a very tough position again. And I don't see how they could have actually, I don't know, pressured Microsoft or did things like that, which would make a significant difference to policymakers. But for sure, like there is a need for something like this. If you ask me, there is a need, but an organization or like a group like this within CISA or somewhere else, I think they do need to have some kind of power. Like they need to be able to either implement some of these policies to force the creation of, let's say, new regulations or new executive orders or whatever. Otherwise, it'll be just you know yet another advisory board that's publishing advisories without significant impact on the real world.
Yeah, I think the lack of power that you guys both mentioned is the real problem. If it's just a board made up of outside, non-government employees who are obviously all subject matter experts and have a variety of perspectives on whatever the issue is that they're looking at, that's great, and there's some value in that, but they don't have the a real mechanism to affect change. Like you said, Costin, like they
Mm.
don't have any real way to say, okay, here are our recommendations. Now go follow them. Like if Microsoft looked at the CSRB report and you had said, yeah, thanks, we appreciate it. Cool. We got our own people in here. We know what we're doing, which they easily could have done. They did make some changes in the aftermath of that
I
report.
was gonna say, isn't that exactly what they did,
They
right?
did
Like,
in large part, but they made some changes, but they don't have any responsibility to do that. They,
right.
And how
and
many were actually triggered by that report? How many
I don't
were
know.
like saving face or like let's do something, or even measures that were planned long before the report dropped? Like they were
Right.
going to do that anyway. So
And
I don't know if there's like a direct connection at the
yeah,
practical level.
and I don't know if there's a real way to reformat this, like you suggested, Juan, that would give them any actual power without it being a governmental body itself, like some sort of
Yeah.
inspector general type situation, but those exist inside specific departments. They're not, broad functions that look at outside things like Salt Typhoon or Log4j.
Yeah. I think, look, to the point of Errata Rob or Rob Graham's post, which, I mean, I think Rob can be insightful. I think he has had a tendency to be a bit of an edgelord in the recent couple of years. So I might have dismissed this a little more, but he's got a good point about the fact that, like, the CSRB kind of wanted to model itself after the NTSB, and the National Transportation Safety Board. And I think that's a lofty and an accurate aspiration. Like that is what I would like to see for cyber. But it kind of, it was this sort of notion of like, let's get an NTSB for cyber. The NTSB, for those of you that don't know, is like, it reviews like transportation accidents, and it's sort of like a post-mortem body for saying like, why did this plane crash happen, or whatever. Like it's more of and in that sense, it does an extremely like useful and objective function. But to be fair to the CSRB, for whatever reason, like the NTSB has subpoena powers. Like it is a different kind of organization, and it's doing. This is where JD Work, I think, is very on the nose and on point about what he said. They're looking. It's a post-mortem. You're looking back at something that happened and is already concluded. You have subpoena powers to actually compel information and try to get to ground truth. You're putting out a technical report. You're not espousing a particular like political agenda or a given program that your little pet project for this week. Instead, you're saying like, look, this is why this happened, and this is how we can avoid this happening ever again. And that's where you're reminded of how well things go with, like, for example, aviation industry regulations, or even with regulations for car safety, and that goes extremely well. But those are not reports where the NTSB says, and if you follow, if you support this cool little initiative and project of ours, then everything will be great someday in the far-flung future for some vague reason. Instead, you're saying like, look, man, like you can't build planes and put them out there without having tested them in this, that, and the other way, and without having tried this, that, and the other thing. And look, in this particular situation, that one function and having done this thing killed a bunch of people. So like, don't fucking do that again. Like that is a very different thing than what we get with like the Microsoft Exchange report.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the only real comparison that we have is the NTSB. There's nothing else that we can really put it up against. And like you said, Juan, the NTSB has a specific function because they're dealing with things where people die,
Right.
train derailments, plane crashes, those sorts of things, which thankfully we have not really seen in cyber attacks yet. Everybody has been predicting it as long as we've all been doing this, but hasn't really happened yet. So that, people don't equate the two because in some ways the stakes are lower or different.
It's interesting. Like, if you don't mind me injecting in there,
Yeah.
Dennis, just because of a point that you bring up about like people dying. We had a predictions webinar at S1, and Drea London, who runs our DFIR team, is an amazing peer. She made a comment very briefly about like, well, somebody asked the question in the Q&A section about like, well, has ransomware ever killed someone? And between Drea and Steve Stone, they very quickly were like, oh yeah, this happens all the time. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, there are apparently objective studies from the medical sector where they're basically saying, oh yeah, there's been like between 30 and 60 deaths that we can attribute to care not being properly administered or something not being available in a hospital because it had been ransomed. And I thought that was like a really interesting thing to just like, I think actually Steve Stone is the one who just kind of like snuck that in there very quickly. I'm like, that is not a small thing. That is the kind of thing that I think would be fascinating to see a CSRB review of, where you're not going after a particular hospital, you're not going after a particular brand. You're saying, hey, let's look at this phenomenon that people seem to think is not yet happening or does not yet have real effects. And let's discuss the fact that like, through casual lack of availability or poor administration or lack of resources, or hey, you can't get an MRI at this time or whatever, 30 to 60 people in a given time period have died essentially as a relatively direct cause from ransomware. And this is being detailed by the healthcare industry, not by some company that wants to hype up their product in cyber.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that I would love to see, right?
That's a good point. I do remember there was one case in Germany I remember from a couple years ago, and then I think last year there was a hospital in the UK National Health System that got hit with ransomware, and a report came out a few months ago about how bad that was and what the delay in care and what the consequences were. I don't remember the exact numbers, but yeah, you're right, Jax. Yeah.
I just think
Mm.
to your point, right, about the CS, like there are things that you could be studying. They're
Yeah.
not necessarily the sexiest things, right? Like BEC, a business email compromise and romance scam side of the house, right? You're talking about something that the FBI claims is like a $3 billion or $2 billion loss leader a
Hmm.
year. And it's not sexy. Nobody wants to work on pig butchering. It's just sad. But that is a much more sizable problematic area that we should pay attention to rather than like super sexy APT gets into this place. You go, yeah, that sucks. Okay, right? Like, what are we talking about? What is the systemic issue that we're trying to address here?
And by the way, I think one of the other problems that everyone was complaining about, or at least that was the perception that I had, and perhaps this is a good recommendation for the next iteration of CSRB, is I think that nowadays everything's changing so fast. So the kind of information that you were investigating a month ago, like nobody cares anymore, or it's like no longer that important or relevant because something new dropped, which is way more severe or significant. And I think that in terms of transparency, all these organizations could probably do a lot better if they issued things like, I don't know, weekly reports or weekly updates, or even if it's something like a monthly update on whatever topic is being investigated. That helps a lot because I think, and I've seen this by the way, on the private side of things as well, on the private sector. If you don't do some kind of let's say work promoting let's say your achievements and your results and being transparent and showing exactly how you are spending the money that people put into your organization, then you're gonna get disbanded or canceled. So one of my recommendations here would be like to be more active on not necessarily TikTok, right? But be more active on social media or on their like whatever website with updates on what's being done, like what is the current situation. If they have some preliminary findings, I think everyone could use those, and just be a bit better, with transparency and how the money are being spent. And I think that would help a lot in the future.
Honestly, I don't know, man. Like on that front, it's sort of antithetical. Like I think no one's gonna look at CISA and say that they didn't do enough social media shit. If anything, they did way too much of it. But like with the CS, not to make a straw man out of what you're saying, right? Like the
Yeah.
CSRB didn't. I don't know if they could have, right? Like you're supposedly doing an
Yeah.
active investigation, right? Like you're not supposed to. What I think the ultimate failure of this thing is rooted in CISA's identity crisis about wanting to be the tech sector's best friend, like they're the cool uncle, not no longer the cool aunt, but the cool uncle of the tech sector, which meant that like you didn't really want to be a regulatory body, like you didn't want to be a regulator, right? Nobody's going to want to talk to you if you are a regulator, but at the same time that's where you get that crippling limitation to the CSRB of like, well, that also means we don't have subpoena power. We're not compelling people under like threat of perjury to come tell us the fucking truth. Like, come tell us what happened. And if we find out that you're lying, you're going to be fined or you're going to go to jail or you're going to do whatever. Um, that is a necessary factor anywhere that you're trying to get accountability, but especially in a tech sector where we see tech CEOs routinely lying to Congress, where it is, a problematic, a liability.
Yeah.
So what makes us think that any of these companies are literally like genuinely walking up gingerly, enthusiastically to like give you a genuine accounting of what happened? Like, I trust the researchers and the independent people that you bring in, but at the end of the day, what happens inside of a hack at Microsoft? Like, we have enough smoke signals and reports, and like people can write blogs, but you're not going to know, like, oh, actually, like, yeah, we fucked this up, or like this person like did something they weren't supposed to, or like somebody had access to data they shouldn't have, and like here's all the tech debt, and this is the PM who made the decision that like, oh, actually we don't care to secure this thing, and like that genuine accountability and accounting of how we got here is not anything these companies are going to proffer. And frankly, why would they? Right? Like, okay, so you're going to go turn this into like a straw man, like
There's
beat
no
the shit
reason.
out of me publicly. Like,
Yeah.
no, thank you. Right.
And I've watched enough of those congressional hearings over the last 15, 20 years when they do call some of these execs in, or people to talk about, big industry issues or specific attacks. And they spend the first 15 minutes of the hearing thanking them profusely for coming and congratulating them on all their success and all of that kind of thing. And then they ask them two, very vague questions, unless Wyden is on the committee, in which case there are actual questions. But otherwise, it's very fluffy and very backslappy, because that's how Washington works. And that's how all of this works. So the CSRB was meant to be outside of that. And as far as I know, it was. But you can't, I don't know how you set up a truly independent body that does have the power that you're talking about, Jags, with subpoena power or regulatory power. I don't think that's happening in the next 4 years.
Oh no, absolutely. Like, I mean, if we're in the land of missed opportunities, not having tried to involve any kind of like genuine regulation, software liability, whatever, you're definitely not going to get it now in the like supposedly libertarian, really like ultra corporate administration we have just walked into, right? Like what you see with all these very selective like changes to like executive orders and everything, like all of a sudden like there's preferential treatment for like crypto, for like let's take all the problems and the screws out with like AI, like, oh, this was such a big problem, no longer a problem, don't worry about it. Like everything is just, you're just kind of throwing the whole thing out. And what you see even with folks in tech is this, the reason I say like pseudo libertarian is we're watching something like, I don't want to get ultra political, people get very pissy about this, but like we're watching something go down that's like pretty like shady and shitty looking, very openly so. And then you get a lot of people who I think want to find some solace, and they go, well, at least we're going to get smaller government, which is something that like old school Republicans and frankly anyone who's ever worked inside of the government wants, because they know that how inefficient the government is, like how many people are there who are like unfireable even though they suck, like all these things. But boy, the way we're trying to get that smaller government is fucking ugly. Like this is just not a pretty situation.
Okay. So one of the things that we saw crop up this week on the CISA side of things is CISA and FBI put out a joint advisory about some Ivanti bugs that were disclosed in September and October, if I remember correctly. Two sets of 2 bugs each, 4 separate bugs that have been exploited over the past few months, and they detailed 2 separate exploit chains that were in use, and also 3 different organizations that had been compromised with these bugs. They didn't name the organizations, obviously, but laid out the scenarios in which they were hit and how they detected it. And it's always interesting to me when they put out these advisories with some, pretty detailed information, which I assume means they have more information that they're not putting out as well. This is just what they want to share publicly. But was there anything in there that caught your eye specifically, Costin?
Yeah, so it seemed to me that this was like kind of a big bucket of things, because they put together a bunch of 0 days, which I think you can associate it with multiple clusters of activity. At least that's how I read it. I put like all the IOCs through my systems. I think only one of the hashes was associated with some past activity that I investigated. There were like a lot of new ones. So just to give you an example, I think about 5 hashes from this document are on VirusTotal, and there's like 2 dozen which are not on VirusTotal. That's one thing. Uh, by the way, it's always my recommendation to CISA, FBI, whoever publishes an advisory like this. If you know that the samples are not on VirusTotal, you're doing like a huge service to the community if you can just upload them to VirusTotal. So whenever you do that, please upload the samples to VirusTotal, because basically out of these IOCs from the document, only 5 of them, I think, are available. Now, in terms of the other IOCs, I looked at the IP addresses, and by the way, there's there's a warning in there with the IOCs. They say disclaimer, and I quote: "Some IP addresses in this cybersecurity advisory may be associated with legitimate activity, and organizations are encouraged to investigate the activity around these IP addresses prior to taking action such as blocking." Like whenever I see this, it pains me. It's so painful to read things like this, because you expect a okay organization, $3 billion budget, again, top talent, like the top talent of the nation, they were saying,
Uh,
they would be able to say which indicators are reliable and which indicators are not reliable. So I did actually look at the IP addresses, and what's in there. There's like a bunch of Tor exit nodes. So if you check the traffic from those from the Tor exit nodes, they can be anything basically, not necessarily this Ivanti activity. Then there's
right.
a bunch of VPNs like ExpressVPN, for instance, which again, ExpressVPN, even like I use ExpressVPN among 10 other VPNs that I use for different kinds of
Chained
purposes.
together, one on top of each
Chained
other.
together, exactly.
A
uh,
layer cake of VPNs.
Yeah.
there's like a bunch of other VPNs, and then there's a couple of IP addresses which I personally cannot associate with any VPNs. So I think it would have been nice to group them in clusters, like say at least these are Tor exit nodes, these are VPNs, ExpressVPN, iVPN, and so on. And these, we can't associate them with any known anonymization services. And these are, let's say, medium high likelihood they are associated with these threat actors, which, by the way, would have been very useful to say. These are 5 different threat actors or clusters of activity. So this report is not about one single APT or UNC or whatever. It's about multiple thingies.
Yeah.
So just take it as such. So these are like kind of me nitpicking the report. I mean, I'm happy there's some IOCs hashes. Kind of unhappy there's no Yara rules, but I mean, this is something we can work with. I'm just saying that the quality of these reports could be improved, and if they really wanted to improve the quality, then it's really worth paying attention to the kind of IOCs that you publish and their quality. And it's not that difficult to put them through a threat intelligence platform to see what are Tor exit nodes, which ones are VPNs, and so on.
I think part of the so not to maybe be too forgiving on this front, but I'm I agree with you, Kosin, about wanting them to disambiguate the stuff about the IPs. Like IPs in themselves are difficult, right? Like IPs get cycled, they get used for different things. Then like w- I can see the value to putting out like, look, these are we've seen them come through Tor. Here's some exit nodes, but like you kind of label that carefully. You go just FYI, right? Because if you do have a specific timeline, what are the chances that your enterprise needed to like that there are legitimate connections from Tor exit nodes to your enterprise on certain systems, right? So like there is a value to being able to search with these things. What I would what I'm curious about is how much of this activity is entirely reliant on um, Tor exit nodes, VPN nodes, and then what I would assume are residential proxy IPs, because that's what we see with a lot of these orb networks. That, look, I'm just going to guess that there's at least one, if not a bunch of Chinese APTs that are being reported on here. And I'm curious if they could even tell us if that's the case, because it's not easy, right? Like when you're just investigating one of these shitty, like appliance led investigations, you're lucky if you can recover stuff from the appliance that lets you know kind of the exploit chain. So to begin with, like, it's cool that they could put that out there and kind of show us, like, look, these are some of the exploit chains that are in there. Great. Um, but it's hard enough there to be able to say, oh, this one was exploited by this threat actor, that was exploited by this other threat actor. Then you have this ephemeral infrastructure that's being used for it. And then you have the possibility of sort of these residential proxies being used also as exit nodes, which is what I assume they were referring to with that warning. Though, you telling me there's Tor nodes and stuff in there, that's more likely it. But this goes back to what we keep discussing in this podcast when it comes to the typhoons, which I'm not saying this is like an advanced typhoon type of activity. It doesn't need to be. Um, but this is part of the problem of like them engineering into our blind spots. Like, what do you share with people when you're telling them, uh, look, here's an operation that comes out of things you probably shouldn't block because they're being reused by 10 different, teams, 10 different folks, and it's also used for legitimate purposes. And then what they're doing is leveraging this exploit chain to hit a device that you can't inspect, to then live there in ways that you can't stop, to then do things in ways that you won't see. Like, what do you tell people?
This is something I wanted to ask you guys, which is they share other stuff privately, right? Through ISACs and like trust groups and that kind of stuff. So how do they make those decisions? I don't know if you have any insight on this, Jags, but how do they make those decisions of like, okay, this goes in the public advisory. This we might seed out in different ways. Maybe, yeah, we probably know it's this group or that sort of thing.
I don't know that I can give too much insight into the particulars of the decision making here. In particular, because I don't know that there's like an established, well documented or well thought out process. I I collaborated a lot closer with CISA on stuff that made it out to advisories a long time ago, before really the great falling out, right? And what you would get was a largely dependent process that was not at all well structured, and then sometimes felt really arbitrary. Like there were moments when we gave stuff to CISA that no one else had for the sake of saying, hey, like get this out there quickly, help people out. And you give them the full reversing, you give them a sample, you give them all this stuff, and they go, well, we need our own people to do this. And like they send it to some Booz Allen contractor, and it takes them 4 weeks to come back with something like that's like a portion of what you had handed them. I'm hoping they kind of ironed out some of the kinks, but I doubt it. Uh, at the same time, what I'm trying to point to here is that because a lot of this, if not all of it, is not coming from CISA, like they're not producing this intelligence, almost certainly not producing this intelligence, it's really quite contingent on like what partner shared what with you at what time, at what level of TLP, with what level of comfort, then how much of that does CISA feel comfortable being able to dual source or obfuscate in some way, because it's not that they're particularly concerned about this being accurate as much as they have this complete allergy to the potential of vendor favoritism being shown in any of these advisories. So even though, I mean, I look at this and I look at the IOC list and I see a CrowdStrike sensor ID, and that tells me,
What's
well,
that? Yeah.
yeah, and but to me, I'm like, well, we can at least assume CrowdStrike contributed some of the background information to this. Thank you, CrowdStrike. But it goes, it, it makes me wonder: is this whole cloth just CrowdStrike gave us all this shit? We turned it into an advisory, slapped the CISA FBI logo on it,
Mm.
or or how much of it is they gave us a portion, and the rest of it is stuff the FBI worked on, let's say. So it's hard to say what makes it in there. I do think it's obvious to any practitioner that like there isn't much of an Intel standard, especially in the handling of structured data and IOCs, which is why every single report is a uh, let's wait and see and check, and how much can we rely on this one, and how many false positives are on this other one, and which of these IPs are properly labeled as ephemeral things, and which ones are not labeled, not accurately labeled, and therefore like you just kind of like shove everything as if it's all adversary infrastructure. Like there is no, I don't think there's a CISA report that you can just take, copy, paste into detection systems and move on. Like it all needs somebody to double, triple, quadruple check the work and then try to come back with something cleaned up and better.
And but by the way, one of the things that are super obvious with these reports, which kind of hints to what you're saying, Juan, that there's multiple organizations, contractors, companies contributing, is that the quality of these reports varies a lot. So there's reports which look, let's say, kind of look in a certain way, or their Yara rules look in a certain fashion, and then another report drops which looks quite different from that
Mhm.
one, and then another report drops which is like even like stranger or looks in a totally different way from the previous two. So in a way, this kind of lack of a kind of a common format for the reports or style or the information is another quite annoying thing to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's the reason, but if the reason is that they, like you're saying, they just take like a private report, like copy paste some things and turn it into a public one. I think it would be quite beneficial if they could just say, we worked with CrowdStrike, or based on the information we received from Mandiant. Here's this report. Thank you, Mandiant, for providing us with all this information. I think that
Is
would be nice.
and I've even noticed that disparity in the way that the quality and the format of these things as an outside observer, not as a practitioner like you guys. And even I can sort of tell, like, well, this sure looks like it came from this company, or this looks like it came from this company, because there's some overlap in the way that they speak about these things, or in the specific targets or something like that. I've always wondered why there isn't a standard format for these type of reports, both inside, like across the community. There's a specific format for like academic papers, or scientific papers. That's a different standard, obviously, but wouldn't it be helpful for you guys and everyone else if there was a standard format of like, here's, these 5 things are going to be in this report, and here's the way that we're going to talk about them, and here's the way that we're going to format them. And if they're not in there, then there's either a good reason, or whatever it is. But why is there no like real standard for this kind of stuff?
Like, I mean, excellent point. I think that would be awesome, because I mean, in all sorts of different companies, like security companies, each company kind of has their own style or report. I like personally, I like a lot how ESET kind of structures their recent reports, in which they have they typically start with the phrase that you can just copy paste it into your systems, because it immediately, in a couple of words, it tells you what this report is about, like very brief, very to the point. And that is like extremely useful, because it saves time. Like you can just copy paste that. The other thing which I personally like a lot of is when companies, in addition to dropping the IOCs in the report, they also at the end they have a link to their GitHub, where they have all these IOCs in a kind of a machine readable format. So that's
Mhm.
amazing. When you see that in a report, like here's the IOCs, but by the way, the IOCs can also be found on our GitHub, and here's the link. That's fantastic. Perhaps I mean, in this case, Mm, I think it also helps a lot when you have one editor who is kind of responsible for the reports to look in the same way. And this is what we used to do all these years back at my previous job. So we had like one guy who was essentially um, in charge of how the reports look, and whenever the reports go out, they have his blessing essentially. And perhaps, yeah, this is one of the things which are missing, to have someone who is responsible in providing a kind of a unified format of all these reports. But to be honest, I think that's also a big challenge, because you see some of these reports, they are CISA alone, or CISA and FBI, or
Mhm.
CISA and SA and CSC, or CISA, CSC, and UK and CSC. And like every single one of these maybe looks a bit different from the others, because of the complexity and how many different organizations have contributed to the report.
Yeah, it just seems really
I,
inefficient. I don't know.
well, you're talking about having a standard, and the thing with standards is, I think it's a two-sided issue. The first one is, you can't really have a standard without a semblance of enforcement. Like it that at best you have a lot of good faith adoption, and that's it. You also can't drive a standard without a semblance of obvious utility. Like, what is the value of having of following the standard? And when it comes to reporting, that can be a little squishier, right? Like it's a long form written thing, so it's not like you need it to be machine readable, or it has to follow an exact path. And in some ways, I feel like if you look at the top TI producers, the people that have really like have been doing it for a long time and doing it well, there's almost an implicit template, right? Like and I mean, I do it for my courses and I do it for my team as well, where like I'll just start a doc and it's literally like title, subtitle, executive summary, introduction of the threat, discussion of the threat actor, technical overview of like what it is that we're actually analyzing, which scopes what you're going to go into. Then you go into the particulars, like this is the malware, this is, whatever types of the malware are there. Then you go into the network stuff, like this is the pivoting that we did on the network stuff. You discuss any attributory artifacts that you can discuss, attribution, whatever. Then you have some kind of a conclusion, like brief conclusion, and then it's the technical appendix, which is what a lot of people just skip to. And you go, hopefully you break down with some minor analysis, yeah, tables of like hashes, file names, mutexes, network IOCs, IPs, domains, etc., and some Yara rules, right? Like that is in essence the template. And folks will variate. They'll do some variation of that. But if you look at Mandiant reports, ESET reports, ours, Sentinel One, the stuff that Kaspersky used to put out, like they all kind of follow that similar template. However, at the end of the day, because this is being done for marketing and it's not being done for neither an academic review of any kind of sort or any kind of standard enforcement, it's a goodwill approach to it. Like, did you decide to go this way so it looks familiar and comforting and is approachable? But my deeper concern is more about the analytical standard, right? Like, I don't super care how you write it. You can make it a fucking like listicle full of gifs and memes for all I care. If what you tell me is this looks non-standard, but the quality of the work, you can take it to the bank. Like you can trust these fucking people on what they did. I'll take that. My bigger issue right now is much more, it's under the hood. It's that they might write a report in the perfect template that we asked for, but when you start, you still have to go pull out all the samples you can get and make sure that they're actually what these people said they are. You still have to go double check all the IPs, make sure that they're not going to make you block something that you shouldn't block. You still have to take the Yara rule and test it and make sure that it even runs. And if it does run, is it full of false positives or not? And, this isn't just nitpick, like, this is pulling out, zooming out, and not just like picking on CISA. This is a problem across the board of the industry. Like right now, you're going on the reputations of certain TI producers that have already been doing it for a while. And you look at shops like Mandiant, and you have to have a lot of respect for how much analytical tradecraft is emphasized inside of Mandiant. Like they really, and you kind of have to, right? Like when you have a consultant shop with like hundreds of people, and you need to be very careful about TLP because some of those things are, a lot of those things are coming from incident response engagements. Like you need to structure yourself in a way, and it can't just be Scout's honor. But in many ways, that means like while I give Mandiant shit for like maybe being like over bureaucratic in how they handle their clusters, I still admire them immensely as a place that has um, developed and figured out a way to enforce an analytical standard. And they are an outlier compared to basically most other Intel producers, which then leads to the true concern, which is what's happening when you get some random shop, some 2-bit, new startup with a blog, or some shitty company that wants to pretend they're a TI or security company for this for this quarter so that they can make their numbers look good because they slipped into security. And then yeah, those people can use the template, but by God, like what the fuck standard are we dealing with here? It's basically prompting us to double the work.
And by the way, speaking of some of the IPs that you were saying, I think I forgot to mention that some of the IP addresses in this list are Telegram IP addresses,
Oh.
like the messenger, the Telegram messenger.
Like
So
they're the Telegram infra?
yes, they're
Oh.
Telegram infrastructure. One of them it's in Russia. I think the other one is in the UK. And I mean, yeah, sure. Would be nice to say that these are generic Telegram infrastructure IP addresses. I can't imagine that the threat actors are actually coming from those IP addresses to hack into your Ivanti device. So more likely, what you're seeing here is just threat actors downloading files from the Telegram CDNs and things like that. But yeah, like I can't still figure out like why people are not paying more attention and doing more serious QA on the IP addresses, domains, IOCs they're putting in these reports.
Is it a question of resources? I mean, aside from Mandiant that you mentioned one, I mean, does every threat intel team have enough resources? I assume CISA probably does. I don't
Could
know.
be, I don't
As
know.
long as they're going to be
CISA
around.
with $3 billion budget, I think they have the budget to buy access to threat intelligence portals that would provide
Yeah.
that information. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I've been building during the past months is exactly that, a portal that allows you to QA IOCs, to understand what these IOCs are: VPNs, door exit nodes, anonymization infrastructure, network attackers, um, CDNs, parking IP addresses, expired domain IP addresses, and so on and so on. Because when you do pivoting, and I think that this is like the most powerful use case, when you do pivoting, you don't want to pivot on things like parking IP addresses, or well, God forbid, I don't know, Cloudflare CDN IP addresses, or even like Telegram CDNs. You don't want to pivot on those because you'll just get into like infinite hits, like the unending deep rabbit hole.
I think part of that is also on the industry, right? Like to Kostin's point, um, look, it's a two-way street. Or maybe, sorry, it's a manifold problem, right? Places can't afford things, and they might be able to buy things. I don't know that there's enough threat intel specific offerings of things that you could just say, okay, I subscribe, I pay Kostin to access his like IOC checking portal. Let's pretend that that's available, and therefore I now know that if I need to double check my IOCs up to a certain standard and have them outputted in some format that everybody's cool with. I just needed to pay the however many $1,000s to have access to this IOC checker that exists in the industry everybody uses. And as long as I tick that box that I ran through there, I am 90% good. And some things are going to fall through, but like it holds me up to a certain standard. Like you can't buy your way to that standard right now. And we can have a discussion about how deficient security, like how deficient offerings are right now for products that are facing the security industry. That's an issue that comes from the VCs. It comes from a lot of misaligned incentives, right? Where you're like, you treat any company that's facing the security industry and trying to provide for its needs as a niche, what's the derogatory term? Lifestyle business, and therefore not something worth pursuing by the bigger companies with the bigger reach. But it also means, so you can't buy your way out of the problem, meaning that the next best thing is what expertise do you have on hand and how much bandwidth do they have to double check everything that goes out of that shop. So if you don't make it systematic, if you don't make it something automatic, um, then it has to rely on human expertise. And I don't know that CISA or anybody can really buy their way to that right now, considering how little expertise is really available, how expensive it generally is, and how essentially uh, clustered and cloistered it is already in like the bigger shops.
Yeah, that's a great point, Juan. I guess I don't know the way things are going if CISA will still be around in its current form for, there's been a lot of speculation on that front. I sure hope it is, but we don't know going forward. So in other vulnerability news this week, there were two that really caught my eye. One was a 0-day in SonicWall, some of their appliances, their SMA 1000 appliance management console specifically, and central management console. And this is another thing like the Ivanti thing we mentioned earlier, where these security appliances really seem to be prime targets these days. I mean, they always have been, I guess, but the last couple years really has kind of emphasized and underscored how much of a problem some of these edge security appliances are in terms of like the number of vulnerabilities on them and how much attackers are going after them. I mean, it really seems like you can't go 2 weeks without seeing a really serious critical bug in some edge security appliance.
Yeah, I mean it's the constant joke of the podcast, right? So to like the vulnerability of the week, and we usually have two or three every fucking week to talk about. But that's actually where I like this CISA report. So let's give them some credit, right? That's where I like this CISA report. We don't know who the threat actors are necessarily. We might not be too happy with the IOCs, the network IOCs. But the focus on the exploit chains is kind of neat because they're telling you, like, look at how threat actors are using these exploits when it comes to these appliances. And when you look at it, you're like, fuck, man, like, this is bullshit, like, baby's first exploit type shit from like the 2000s. Like, this is like, it's like SQL injection. Like, someone was able to like drop a web shell on this thing, unauth like RCE on this thing. Then they like use this other thing for like escalation of privileges, or they use this other thing to be able to like run any arbitrary file on the system. So like, yeah, they chain two exploits, two CVEs, quote unquote. But it's like, what are those CVEs? Are like the two simplest fucking bugs that any system has ever had in it, like internet facing bullshit that you were able to get out of like Frack or Daily Dave like 20 fucking years ago. That's what is being used on your fancy, probably, I don't know how much an appliance sells for. I'm gonna assume it's in the 5-figure range, and this shit is like just confetti software, right? Like, it's just nonsense. So in that, I appreciate the transparency, and I do want us to like keep calling them out. We are gonna keep seeing these fucking vulnerabilities forever, because look at the standard of software that's in these things. There is no attempt to secure that.
Yeah.
By the way, maybe like as a kind of a mitigating factor for that would be that a lot of them are end of life, by the way. So a lot of these advisories are about end of life devices. And you can say like, man, who's at fault here, right? So they're end of line, like there's no more updates for these things, but somehow people still use them. And people use them because either they don't have huge budgets, they can't afford to buy new ones. Uh, and maybe they just work. I mean, they're happy with them. Like, if we replace this device that we've had for the last decade, then we need to replace a lot of other things as well. So that's, again, it's not easy at all to replace them. So um, it's like maybe the chicken and the egg, and like the Ouroboros, or like if you can't fix it because it's too old, it's so old, but you can't replace it, because if you replace it, then you need the budget, and then you need to replace everything. So it feels that whenever you jump into this can of worms by putting one of these devices into your network, you need to account for a couple of things, and one of them being that they will be end of life after a while, and then you'll need like a new budget to replace them, which is, again, it's all expected. um, but I think that nowadays you also need to factor the fact that these devices will almost um, guaranteed have some 0 days. Like over the time you deploy them in your network and you use them, they will have a bunch of 0 days. It's guaranteed. It doesn't matter which brand it is, and you need to somehow kind of provision for those 0 days. Take it into account. Don't expose them on the internet. Put them behind a firewall. Um, Log everything. Try to keep up with the updates as much as possible, and whenever they are end of life, plan for their replacement.
I mean, with the EOL stuff, like with the end of life appliances, um, I don't even necessarily, I don't know how much to fault people for not rushing to upgrade. What I'm
Sure,
thinking
it
about is
still
like,
work.
Yeah.
right, well, they still work, just very insecurely, but I'm also curious. These are end of life devices. Are the newer versions like not subject to this amount of vulnerabilities? Because like that's the other part. It's like,
There's
okay,
no
you end of
guarantee of
life.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, like at least when Microsoft end of life's like Windows XP, they have a current offering that
Yeah.
Correct.
has its own vulnerabilities, but is not subject to all of the same
Mm.
vulnerabilities that the old ones are. And in this case, like I actually don't feel like I can competently address this. Like I feel like I need to go map like a timeline, a complex timeline of like software versions for each one of these things. But it's simple. If you're going to ask these people to replace it, like replace it with what? How secure is that thing? And this brings me back to something we discussed like multiple times in this podcast about the appliances, but especially when we talk about end of life hardware that like still in essence still works. I keep wishing that we would get like an open WRT style project towards supporting these hardware, because like look, if the hardware is not giving you any limitations, then what is the issue? Why is this end of life? In the sense of like, look, the hard part is
Software.
still working, right?
Yeah.
Like you still have the right
Yeah.
bandwidth, throughput, and functionality being handled by this plucky piece of hardware. So no, why the fuck do I need to throw this thing away? What you're telling me is you're no longer supporting the software stack. And I think that's precisely where there's opportunity in the market or in the open source community to say, well, fuck it. Like, let's make an open WRT or whatever, like Ubiquity equivalent
PF
type
Sense.
thing, PF
Mhm.
Sense, where you go, now PF Sense has like, pay me, this company, this like 5-person consultancy, pay me to give you proper, well QA'd software that gives you the same functionality with the hardware you have, and you can have a support contract and so on and so forth. And I think we see that happening a lot more in like slightly more niche industries or like manufacturing and older industrial plants and so on, where you go, yeah, someone end of life this the support for this manufacturing plant hardware. By end of life, we mean that company went bankrupt
Right.
10 fucking years ago. They don't
Yeah.
exist. But here's a consultant who, or like a small consultancy shop that like has made it their business to just like support and improve and reverse engineer and extend the compatibility and requirements for this. And I think that would actually solve a lot of our problems, because then it's literally, hey, go buy the box from whomever, and then just keep this thing updated. And folks like Kosin are adding plugins for like log collection, and other folks are coming up with their own way of doing sort of like memory dumping. And you break the dependency on these fucking irresponsible companies. But right now, that's pie in the sky unless some very motivated developers get their hands on that hardware and have some like functional base with which to move forward.
Yeah,
And by the way, like to just draw a parallel, and I think that these are, how to say, they are just maybe a lesson, and this is going to be a disaster in the future. Like, I don't know, 10, 15 years from now, with all the smart cars running software that is end of life, and then people pawning them over the internet, ransoming them, like locking people inside the cars, encrypting your engine, I don't know, ransoming your entertainment system. Like, you know it's coming, right? Because the more cars appear, like maybe Tesla is doing like a good job nowadays. Keeping their older models updated. I know it's built into the whole thingy.
Yeah.
But just imagine of all the new smart car brands like electric cars, internet connected cars, that after a while they will no longer be supported, and people will still want to drive them because they still work and they still like them. And we're gonna have like a lot of fun decrypting engines, unlocking the doors. You know,
Well,
it's gonna be so fun.
somebody's going
that's
to make a
what
lot of money in that business. That's for
Well,
sure.
that's where I'm kind of, again, I'm hoping that this becomes more of a thing, right? Like you have a couple of a quote unquote lifestyle businesses doing that sort of support. But I think you already have a corollary that's not support based, which is like what's happening with electric cars, particularly, like I think Fisker Karma, like Fisker made like a really cool looking electric sports car. Like it was
Yeah,
like
they
an
did.
early on thing. It looked super fucking cool. And as far as I know, the company went bankrupt. And so you have, presumably there's a bunch of these really cool little electric sports cars that don't have dedicated support or like service centers or anything like that. And I am, maybe I'm creating a problem out of thin air, and Fisker's still around, or the parts were so um generic or compatible that you can just go and like buy a bunch of stuff that works for a Honda Civic, and you're fine. I don't know, but like I would pay a close attention to that situation for like, okay, where do we go from here? And like in that particular case, what is their software stack? Like, do they have, I don't know that there is a like default all cars compatible software stack that everybody's building on top of, like one cohesive SDK. So even if you do get your Fisker Karma fixed somewhere, like what happens on the software end? So like, yeah, Kosten, I think that's actually really interesting.
It's coming, and I think we can probably start looking already for CNCs. You know, CNCs that are used for receiving telemetry from all these cars that will soon expire. That you can sinkhole and then like see all these smart cars around the world beaming to your sinkhole.
You're gonna have Elon visibility on where they are and where they charge
Like
their shit.
remotely. You know, people will do that. People will sinkhole the endpoints
People
used by these
listening on
cars.
this call
For
are
sure.
going to
You know, there's people like right now, like this very
right now,
second, they're like
Silas.
running strings and extracting all the CNCs and like tapping their GSM 4G connection from their smart card just to see where the telemetry is going and the DNS lookups and all that stuff.
Mark Rogers is, as soon as his recovery is done, it's over for these bitches. He's gonna be grabbing all that.
Don't give these ideas away for free, Costin. Come on. You just came up with like 4 businesses in the last 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm sure we can do more.
We can do more. To the VCs listening, guys, come on.
Yeah.
Try not to kill those.
Yeah, really. We need more, not less. One other thing that caught my eye, I know we're kind of like I know you guys like to do this for like 7 hours, but we're getting there. Another like hardware based thing that I spent a lot of time reading about this week was Lumen's Black Lotus Labs put out a really interesting research report on some Juniper exploitation that they discovered on some Juniper routers with this kind of like magic packet functionality that we've seen before. I as soon as I read it, there was something that stuck in my head. I didn't go back and maybe you guys will remember, but this functionality has been around in other malware before, where there's a backdoor that's just listening for this one specific packet to show up, and then it does things. But it was a really interesting report, and Costin, I know that you kind of looked at this pretty closely. What was your initial reaction to this?
Well, it's super interesting report. I mean, Lumen's Black Lotus lab is kind of killing it. Every month they publish something like super interesting, super cool.
Yeah.
So kudos to them. I went through the report, through the samples, trying to hunt for more. What immediately attracted my attention is that there is some similarity, and I think they also highlight that in the report, that there's just, I don't want to go back to CISA, so like I'm just going to mention briefly. There's a CISA report from August 2023 on two things, the CSPy and Whirlpool, which are backdoors for Barracuda, kind of different family of hardware, but the code base is kind of the same, perhaps due to the fact that they are based on this thing called CDOR, if I remember correctly. So that could explain it. But by just, I think, looking at these backdoors from 2023 and comparing to the new one, I know that Lumen is saying like they can't guarantee that it's the same threat actor or the same cluster of activity, but it kind of looks that this is an evolution of that. The new backdoor is obviously improved. They added this no bus, nobody but us functionality to make sure that the Turla guys don't hijack their backdoors like they do with others. So I thought it was interesting. And important, I guess, to say is that back in the days, Google associated that activity with what they called UNC 4841. Which they assess with high confidence is a cyber espionage actor from China. So I thought that was interesting because the kind of geography in this case is perhaps, I don't know, unusual. Like, but nowadays you do see China reaching out more widely than before, so you kind of find them in places that you haven't seen them previously. I think if you go back to the old days, they were super active in the US, then they kind of diversified. Then they diversified even more, like expanding into spying on different things related to the Silk Road initiative and the Belt and Road initiative, and that kind of widening of their interests is now peaking with Taiwan, obviously, but also the Middle East. And I think that most notably is their huge, big return to target the United States and spying on presidential candidates and so on. Speaking again in general about China. Back to this report, I thought it was quite interesting. It's kind of a very cool discovery. The sample, I think, was uploaded on Virus Total last year. So if anyone else wants to look into that, they can find the sample on Virus Total and try to find more. I did my Yara rules. I did a bit of hunting. I think in total there's 3 samples that kind of, let's say, relate to each other or they're similar to each other. But unfortunately, that's it. 3 samples. I couldn't find more than those 3, and it would be interesting if more people dig into this, because it's not very often that you see these kind of passive backdoors for network equipment.
Yeah, I love that it's built on CDOR. Like it's it's
Mm.
like 20-year-old
What
backdoor,
else have
right?
we
Like,
seen built on Cedar, by the way?
well, funny thing, I actually was wondering if it is actually built on CDOR because
Mm.
Penguin Turla,
Right.
Kurt
Correct.
originally put out that it was built on CDOR, but it
Mm.
wasn't built on CDOR. It was built
Mm.
on
Loki.
Loki,
Mm.
which is yet another 20-year-old Linux backdoor. But you gotta love the backward compatibility of these sort of OSs. It's quite impressive that you can take source code from 2 decades ago and still make it work. Right.
And
I
speaking
did
of
laugh
that,
when I
speaking
saw
of
like the
that,
reference to Packet Storm in their report. I was like,
Right.
wait a second.
Yeah, yeah.
Love it.
I think just the other week, Mike from Sterwell just took the Morris worm source code and he successfully compiled it on the latest Ubuntu, which to me was like
Jeez.
mind
Wow.
blowing that it still works. Like you can still do that. And I did the Yara rule for the Morris worm, which is the same. What is it, 30 years old thingy? Just to see if we can find some of the original samples I compiled for Solaris, for Sun, and Vax architectures. But it's always like great when you see this kind of paleontology stuff and how people nowadays still base their tool set on 20 years old source codes.
Well, I mean, this also made me think of just, the hardware discussion we just had with the security appliances. Routers are sort of in the same category, networking equipment of like they, they don't get replaced very often. Those
Mm.
things sit online for a long time.
Mm.
You're talking lifespans of a decade or more before people pull them out and replace them. They don't get taken offline very often to be updated either. So if you get a foothold on, a whole bunch of Juniper or Cisco or somebody else's routers, there's a good chance you might be able to sit there and hang out for a long time. It sounds like pretty valuable real estate.
Yeah, and I think I've seen Cisco equipment that was 30 years old and was still working. Again, 30 years old with an uptime of 12 years, something like that. Which is again, it's amazing. It's impressive how resilient some of these hardwares are, especially like the really old ones. I mean, as hardware became faster, the CPUs got upgraded, then the kind of the reliability went down a bit. But some of the really old things from 30 years ago, running at, I don't know, 40 megahertz, things like that, they are still super reliable, and they still route packets. They still work. You don't need to reboot them like every couple of weeks because they hang or whatever. They just
The
work.
only thing that end of life's old school Cisco routing hardware is corruption and cheap Huawei like appliances, right? Like you look at Latin American and African ISPs and they're like, oh yeah, we had all this like Cisco shit for the past 10 years. It still works. It works perfectly, but someone got a payoff somewhere, so
Mm.
we just got all this Huawei shit and we like literally throw all these Cisco appliances in the trash, even though they never stopped working. Like they're reliable as shit, right? Or they
Yeah.
were, at least. I don't know. I
They
don't know
were.
anymore. They were.
I think it only once I saw a case when yeah, a Cisco device died. It just died like that. And another case, Cisco sent an email saying that we need to replace it because we have an oscillator inside with a quartz crystal, and the crystal goes bad exactly after something like 3.7 years. Like it
What?
goes bad, and the moment the quartz crystal goes bad, the whole appliance stops working. So to me, that was funny that they know it goes bad exactly 3.7 years. What's
You're
going
muted.
on, Juan? What's going on? You're on mute.
I was just saying,
I think your
even
cat
that
muted
is.
you.
I keep having to like handle my cat's being a menace. So
Uh,
I was just saying, even that is impressive that you have that level of like that
Precision.
the precision. You're like, look, this thing's gonna break on exactly March 15th.
Yeah.
So if you could just replace this little crystal, that would be great.
That sounds like
I
the
miss stuff.
crystal radios I used to build as a kid.
Yeah. I miss stuff like that. Like I hear tales of Solaris systems of old that would be able to run for like 12 fucking years, never had a problem, never
Mhm.
had a reboot. You're like, what must that have been like, right?
I
No
mean,
one knows. I mean, I have to reboot my freaking dishwasher every like 6 weeks, you know.
You
I-
just need
it
to connect
just
it to the internet, bro.
It
there
is
is no.
the internet. That's the whole problem.
I had to reboot my laptop before we started recording because the webcam was misbehaving.
Yeah.
But
Those
like
fucking
I was
implants, man.
thinking, yeah, implants, of course. I was thinking, like, by the way, from the point of view of people who develop implants, imagine you have like this cool implant and you deploy it on some hardware, and then like 5 years pass and it's still there. 10 years pass, and it's still there. 15 years pass, your implant is still there, it still works. And then you need to kind of upgrade your infrastructure, you need to rewrite your command and control endpoints, and you still need to be compatible with that thing from
Right.
15 years ago, because you can't afford to rewrite it or to replace it with something else, because nobody knows how to write code for that super old hardware. Or like, there's no point into developing something new for that, because there's only a handful of them left on the internet. So I think that there's probably some amazing issues that people developing implants have when it comes to supporting stuff running on 15 years old routers, 20 years old routers, and so on.
I mean, I guess it depends on who we're talking about doing this, right? Like, I think that's where it gets really interesting to talk about threat actors um, like Equation Group or the folks maintaining the Regan platform across, Five Eyes, where that has been systematized in a way that is actually quite fascinating, right? Like, you have this modular architecture to the way that that's been developed, and this like compatibility framework with like the Wazowski API and like the things that we've learned so far, where I don't know that they would have a hard time because you have this factory model, right? Where you like can just keep updating certain underlying components and compile for it. But I am sure like that's sort of turning it into like an oversimplistic situation. I'm sure you are correct. And there are some fascinating problems where someone's got to figure out how to like make something work for an IBM framework at a bank somewhere in the language and CPU that is no one has seen in the past two generations of like tech practitioners, right?
And I know there are some interesting books coming out. I can't talk about those cases. I can't talk about like some of the implants leveraging like some unique protocols or discovery or uh, no bus commands and so on. But I think there's some amazing books coming out soon, and that people will love. People will love reading about stories like that, and how you need to support these kind of implants for decades. Simply because they just work and you
They
need to
just
move
work.
on.
Yeah, I do think about that stuff sometimes of like the small tech support team doing the kind of maintenance you just described, Juan, on like
Yeah.
the Equation Group platform or something like that. They're just
Yeah.
like, oh man, I got to update this implant that's been on this server for 7 years. I got to go, figure out why this went offline today. I'll be
Yeah.
right back. It's somebody's job, right?
Yes.
Someone, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. On the APT front, maybe this will be the last thing we hit. On the APT front, we always hear about, Chinese APTs, like we just spoke about, attacking US infrastructure or, Taiwanese or other infrastructure around the world. We don't often hear that much, at least publicly, about, say, Western countries compromising Chinese infrastructure, even though there are people whose full-time jobs, that is, to do exactly that. And there were a few reports that came out recently of, from Chinese firms publishing some information about U.S. attackers going after allegedly Chinese targets, technology firms, advanced materials, design institute, things like that. And I wanted to get your perspective, guys. Like, is there a reason aside from the fact, me and Juan are in the US, Costin, you're in Romania, but is there any reason that we don't see more of this from, say, China or, Iran or North Korea or whatever? Is it just a case of them wanting to keep things in-house and not tell the outside world what they know? Come on,
I
Juan.
can I can I can I can talk about that, and I was thinking that it's one of two reasons. One of them is perhaps that they just don't have those capabilities. They are not able to catch those guys. I mean, we know, like, the top of the top, they are so good that simply they just don't get caught. So perhaps one explanation here is that they don't have the ability to catch the top guys, or like maybe they do catch them from time to time, but whenever they catch them, it's like almost nothing. It's just a trace, no binaries, everything's running in memory. So the best, you have some maybe IP addresses and suspicion that you got pawned, and that's it. Or the other possibility here is, they do have this ability, but they don't expose it. They just don't want to show it to the world. And I think that that was one of the points, why I selected one of these stories for the best research stories of 2024 when we did that um, uh, podcast episode on the best security stories of 2024, because it kind of gives you a glimpse into the capabilities of these Far East, Eastern threat intelligence companies, and actually what they can do. And my feeling is that there are capabilities, there are skilled, competent researchers there in China, in Russia, and so on and so on. Even I think in Iran, there are competent researchers which do have this capability to catch super advanced, sophisticated stuff. But the more likely explanation is that for political reasons, they can't publish about that. And I remember one such case where members of a threat intelligence team from one of these companies, they were asking like, how is it that you guys can publish all this stuff? Isn't how come that your party advisor allows you to publish about that?
Party
Which
advisor.
our immediate reaction was like, so, all right, so that confirms that you have a party advisor that doesn't allow you to publish on everything that you're finding. And I would say that in this mostly like communist mentality, we call it communist mentality again, to cover more countries, there's a very big weight on blaming whoever is responsible for that. So the moment that you admit that you were pawned, like in a very bad fashion, the first thing that the leadership will do is who's responsible. Like, it doesn't matter that you discovered the compromise. Like, you'll never get any kind of medals for that. Even worse, like
You're
the
more
most
likely to get
unfortunate,
shot, right?
you'll get shot, or you'll be sent to Siberia, or you'll be sent to jail simply because you kind of discovered and exposed the incompetency of whoever's in charge of protecting this critical infrastructure objectives. I think because of that, there's a culture of silence. People just, it's better not to talk about it unless you want to get in trouble. Let's maybe just pretend that nothing happened. We just cleaned everything's cool, man. Just move on, do something else. Like, there's no need to
Nothing to see
shoot
here.
yourself in the
Nothing to
foot.
see here.
Yes, I think that's at least in my opinion. I'd be curious to hear what Juan thinks and what the reasons are for that.
I'm it you covered quite a bit of that ground, I think, in general, right? Like, I do think country to country you have very different capabilities, and those capabilities aren't necessarily static, right? Like, you might have a certain part of your industry or a certain group of like very talented folks, and then the question becomes like, did that turn into a self-sustaining capability that you can rely on indefinitely, or is it like, oh, that person defected, left, finally had the benefit of getting the fuck out of this shitty country, and doesn't have to deal with this anymore, meaning you no longer have the capability? Or is it actually something systematic, well spread across your country, and you can rely on it? Which I think would be more the case on like maybe the Chinese and the Russians, less so with like the Iranians, for example. Um, then the other side of this is, I think our expectations are horribly misaligned with the realities of intelligence, which is that take finding something and making it public is kind of the most aberrant thing you can do from an intelligence perspective. Like, I know we have a lot more of that these days, and we've started to kind of almost expect an active dialogue with the security services of different countries. Like, that there is a benefit to telegraphing all this stuff and sharing proactively, right? And like, we're bitching about the quality of what they share. But think of how aberrant that is as a thing that's really taken hold in the past decade or so. Whereas anytime any intelligence practitioner would look at you like you're fucking insane if you were like, oh yeah, we just discovered this thing, and the first thing we should do with it is put it in a blog and like publicly broadcast that to everyone. Like, I can see some semblance of value in that, right? In dissuading and naming and shaming, and in enabling other people to protect against it, sure. But you're telling me that that has more intelligence utility than knowing how you're being spied on, your adversary not knowing that you know, being able to feed them misinformation, tactically and in some capacity, containing and like lulling them into a false sense of security and visibility, even though they think they have access, right? Like, their biggest problem is the discussion we were having earlier of like, oh, we need to bring someone in here to maintain this old back door because these idiots have never found it. And you're like, no, the idiots found it 6 years ago, and they've just been like stringing you along in this ineffective collection. And like, that's a really interesting part of this game. But I think that's where we show our hand as like, yeah, we're threat intelligence experts, but sometimes the threat intelligence space fails to act, it fails to think in the way that the intelligence space does, and take into account how many possibilities and important value propositions are available when you play that game in the way that it's meant to be played in the shadows, as opposed to resorting to this whole like chit chat, Twitter forward version of being an intelligence agency in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think you nailed it right there. One, like the first thing that I think of whenever I see, one of these reports from, say, NSA in the rare cases that they do these things, or even CISA or FBI, of them exposing some North Korean infrastructure or malware set or something like that, is what's the benefit of doing this? Why are they doing this? What message are they trying to send with this report? Because they've probably had this information for X amount of months or possibly even years. Why are they doing this now? Like,
Right.
what's the larger picture here that, might be affected by this? And there always is something, because you're right. Like, the job of an intelligence agency is to go and do stuff that nobody ever notices. Like,
Right.
you're only like, the only time you get noticed usually is if there's some catastrophic failure. You don't want
Right.
people to know what you're doing, right? Your job is to be quiet and do your job. It's not
Yeah.
to run around and telling everybody how good you are at your job.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Like, that's not your job. Also, it has like an immediate sense of diminishing return. Like, the reason you don't, like, maybe you choose to go public, there's a reason you have like a default declassification process like X amount of years later, right? Um, but going public is the end of your ability to use and weaponize the value of this information, because intelligence is a game of information asymmetry. The minute you make that asymmetry a form of parity, it no longer has the value that it did in saying only I know this, and they don't know that I know, and they don't know how I know, meaning that we can leverage that information in a way that others are not privy to. publishing shit literally removes that entire advantage. So I don't blame the IC for not being more enthusiastic about publication. It is something that is very anathema to what they do. And I would actually point to the increased participation of Western intelligence services in this practice that should and probably does make them incredibly uncomfortable as an interesting telegraphing of limitations and shortcomings. I don't think NSA or GCHQ or anybody else came to the table and started to engage with researchers and started to publish reports and started to answer on Twitter because they were dying to have friends. Like, I don't think they were like, oh God, you know what it would be really cool if we had like a much more active like PR department, right? Like, I don't think that those are things that were welcomed. I don't get the sense that people were excited to take them on. I think they did so because they felt they had to. And that's really, really interesting. They felt they had to in cyber in particular. They haven't done that for nuclear. They haven't done that for any of the other many remits. Even so, it's not that like, oh, there's just so much more intelligence out there. There's so much more OSINT capability. There's so much more smart people that we can tap into in our population. That is not something they need to do for cryptography. It is not something they need to do for nuclear secrets. It is something they need to do for cyber. And I think that it's a really important and interesting distinction about our space that tells us to some extent how neutered these organizations are when it comes to defense in cyber in a way that they've never been in just about anything else.
Well, that's a great point. And I think a good portion of that is because a large fraction of the capabilities in cyber, especially in defense, are in private hands. You know, the expertise is
Yeah.
for the large part in the private sector. Yes, of course, every government has their capabilities, but
Yeah.
a lot of this was developed privately, right? So they need the help of the private sector as much as the reverse is true.
Yeah, and it's not just the talent; it's the visibility in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Like I think I got branded Mr. America on this podcast because I kept basically arguing on behalf of the interests of some of these Western intelligence agencies. But it's not because I'm just like a huge stan for GCHQ or NSA as much as like when I look at their situation, when I look at what we recommend and seem to want from like policy perspectives, what we seem to think in the West is a good balance and limitation on the powers of the intelligence community. I see something that is almost paradoxical with the ability to effectively defend in cyber. And that's why, like, it's not that I'm against civil liberties or that I'm super excited about a surveillance state. It's that I think that we're placing limitations on Western intelligence agencies that are kind of arbitrary, kind of like nice to have for us as individuals that are crippling when it comes to cyber defense. And by that, like I know that line is thin. I'm not naive about it. I'm just saying if you have an expectation that NSA is going to be almighty and all knowing in the United States when it comes to intrusions, you can't subsequently also tell them that they can have no interaction whatsoever with US telcos and ISPs. That's where all the fucking visibility is. They can't hack them, right? They're US organizations. So, okay, like where the fuck are they supposed to get any visibility? And I think what we've accepted is, well, they don't have any. So hopefully they're getting cooperation. You go, okay, well, can they compel cooperation? You go, no, they can't. And you go, okay, so this is all being left to the goodwill of American companies. And that's when you hang yourself off the side of the building because you know that this shit's not gonna work, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, we are almost at 2 hours, and I know you guys you have to get on a train or something, Juan.
Yeah.
Like it's the 1800s. But anyway, I know you guys
I'm going on safari. Yeah.
going to the Great West
Yeah.
over the Rockies. You guys always do a few shout outs at the end of the pod. Ryan wanted me to shout out a few things for him as you mentioned Juan earlier, he's at the Nebula Fog AI Hackathon, which I don't know anything about. Sounds cool. He also wanted to shout out the new Virus Total book that's now available in English, which I need to go and read. I
I
saw
just got my
Ryan's.
copy in Spanish, and now I kind of wish
Mm.
I'd waited for the English one, but fuck it.
Come on, your Spanish is good enough, isn't it?
It's sure.
You sure? Doesn't sound confident. Anything else? I have a couple of others that I want to hit, but you guys go ahead.
Well, on the Nebula Fog thing, I think it's our friend Rob Reagan's project, and I wish I could have joined. It sounds super cool. They have this like really nice website there, so if you want to check it out. But basically, they're doing this like big AI hackathon in SF, which sounds actually really interesting. Um, for what were the other Ryan shout outs? I think for Reverse IO is something that Ryan had mentioned that I'm actually really excited about. We our friends over at Vector 35, Jordan Weans, and some of the other folks are putting together a new reversing conference, which is taking place, I believe, next month
I think
in
that's
Where is
Orlando.
it?
It's
Orlando?
yeah, Reverse IO in Orlando. I'll be there. I'm looking forward to it. I honestly like not to stir the pot, but uh, I'm very excited for this to arise as a replacement for Recon, not as a complement to Recon. And I say that just because I think the you've heard me complain on this podcast about like the organization of Recon these days and just how kind of poorly managed it is, and it's sad because it's it was the only reverse engineering focused conference, like really high end reverse engineering stuff, and it has been for like 20 or some so years. But it's kind of fallen into a bit of disrepair, and that is quite sad, not just for the love of Recon, but rather because it's not like there has been a replacement in place until now. So I think folks have like really high expectations that this is going to be it, that this is going to be the thing that kind of picks up the baton for Recon, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Awesome. Anything on your end, Costin?
I mean, we've spoken about Bernardo's new book, so I'm super happy to see that out in English, pre-order or order on Amazon. I'm sure it'll be super entertained. There's a lot of cool stories in the book. And in addition to that, I think there were a bunch of interesting magic money stories. We like to cover these magic money stories in some of the previous episodes. And now that the United States has a president who is a big fan of magic money, even has his own magic money, I think that it is worth saying a few shout outs to all the people who are working on security related to magic money, like such as forensic, tracing malicious actors, leveraging cryptocurrencies, and so on. And in particular, I know there were some disturbing incidents which happened today. One of the co founders of a cryptocurrency wallet was kidnapped. Together with his wife, had one of his fingers cut, and as the kidnappers were asking for 100 bitcoins in ransom. So again, if you're into this field, cryptocurrencies, I would say that yeah, pay attention to how you advertise and what you talk about, and try to stay safe.
Yikes. I didn't read that. That's not good. That's scary. Jeez. Yeah, magic internet money is getting serious, man. um, one shout out from me. I wanted to just point people to some of the research that working with the research team at Census now,
Oh, nice.
and they do a lot of really cool stuff that is doesn't always see the light of day, but it's about to. So go and have a look at the blog. They're publishing a lot more stuff recently. Silas Cutler just did a really cool piece on some Volt Typhoon activity that you guys would probably like and other people should go check out. And there's just a bunch of other really good, unique research there. So check it out. So, boys, I really enjoyed it. This was great. It's great to see you both. It's been a long time. Hopefully, it won't be a long time before I see you again.
Thanks, man. Thanks for picking up the baton, and shout out to our boy Ryan. We miss him and his tinfoil hat, of course, but hopefully he'll come back with some great understanding
Conspiracy Ryan.
of AI.
Conspiracy Ryan, always.
Conspiracy
Gonna
Ryan.
come teach us some AI shit.
Oh, I can't wait for that. Good Lord. All right, guys. Have a great week. I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye, ciao.